I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you all for listening. This is my third annual birthday episode. If I get this edited in time, then it will be coming out on my birthday. 41, not a notable birthday for the most part, though I have my own odd associations with it. So I've been getting ready to teach this horror class, Intro to Horror. It's just a little 4-week, 2 hours a week. It's a workshop-y, talky, seminar-ish sort of thing for adults in the area. And I've never taught it before. I always liked reading horror and watching horror movies, and have been thinking about some writing. I mean, I've written some stories you could describe that way, and they're it's really what I started writing as a kid. And I've been thinking about something longer, a little bit further down the road. But, it was, I thought it was kind of an interesting idea, and with any luck, some people will sign up for it. I think I know what I'm going to teach, but I'm still looking at some possibilities. And among them, I think will not be, although I was born on lottery day, I don't think I'm going to teach the lottery, just because I sort of assume everyone's already read it. Like, I assume it's sort of too well, like everybody read it in grade school, probably. And, I'll include some stories that are well known, but I'm kind of just looking to find some interesting selections for prompting some conversation, and maybe pointing to a few different possibilities for horror, but mostly just like stories I like and I think are worth reading. So anyway, I have ideas of basically what I want to teach, but I'm looking at some other stuff right now. And one story that came to mind was E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman. I had never read The Sandman, but I love and have many times read Freud's essay, The Uncanny, which I think I've mentioned it on the podcast. If I haven't properly talked about it, I should do that at some point, because it's just so good. If you write fiction, particularly if you write any kind of fiction, you are interested. If you're interested in being scary or spooky or even just weird or eerie, you really have to read it. It's so good. The Uncanny by Freud. I'll include a link in the show notes. It's free online. But in that essay, he describes this story by E.T.A. Hoffman, who's a famous, I guess he's a romantic writer, which seems to kind of fit. He was writing in the early 19th century, and so Freud describes this story of his called The Sandman. He pulls these elements out of the story to talk about, and he says basically that the story exemplifies this concept of the uncanny as he understands it. It's an interesting argument, but, I had always found the story he referred to and kind of summarizes, I'd found it really haunting. Like, he pulls out these sort of chilling scenes and images and links them in a way that, makes his argument pretty persuasive, but also just makes it sound like a really, really scary, weird story. So I sought it out, read it. And it's not that it's bad. I mean, especially the beginning, I think, is pretty good. Like, he does a pretty good job of evoking like childhood fear of a kind of boogeyman, and the way that like the real life fears of adulthood can kind of superimpose themselves on like childhood monsters. So I mean that I think is quite good, but it just goes on so fucking long. Freud summarizes the story in probably like a page and a half, and the Hoffman story is like 35, 40 pages, depending on how you print it out. I mean, it's really long, and it doesn't need to be. I mean, there are some interesting elements that Freud doesn't include, but mostly it's just, he just takes a really long time to get through what is effectively a pretty, like, where Freud's treatment is economical and haunting, Hoffman's treatment is, on balance, really baggy and sort of unnecessarily complicated. And then, worst of all, it gets a little bit hokey. Like, Freud is very dry and clinical in his treatment of this horror story. Hoffman is histrionic, and it just gets to be sort of too much. So that even though, you see a lot of good reason for the main character to be driven to distraction, the actual state of his distraction just feels a little bit overblown. So anyway, this was not a terrible disappointment. Hoffman is celebrated, and he is celebrated for good reason. I assume I need to read more of his work. I also think reading older horror stories. I just read a Hawthorne story today called Young Goodman Brown, which is sort of cool and weird, but I think some of it, I think there are some ways in which we have gotten better at writing horror stories, maybe. It's not that it's a relatively young genre of story. There is horror is a very old emotion, but this sort of a short story specifically aimed at evoking this feeling, it seems to be kind of young, at least in the way that we understand short stories to work. And Hawthorne's is also it's cool in a lot of ways, but it feels very heavy-handed, and it feels and the main character again just feels sort of too. So it feels sort of exasperatingly emotional in ways that just seem I don't know. I mean, horror is hard to do well. A lot of it is sort of goofy, but I think, as with old comedy, it doesn't always age very well. I mean, that really may be it. Just that the horrors of one era are not the horrors of another. I think a lot of the horror I like best is cuts against itself with tone, and leaves at least allows us to be, maybe when you're inventing a genre, you have to be a little bolder about conveying the themes and the possibilities that you're getting at. But whereas when it is well established, the kinds of things that can happen in a certain sort of story, then you don't need to do very much to hint at them. And so yeah, I mean, surely later horror writers are benefiting from the work of Hoffman and Hawthorne and Poe and all those guys. At any rate, this is not an episode about horror. What it really brought to mind, though, the experience of reading the story after kind of having already heard a version of it, was an experience I had a lot as a kid, because many of my bedtime stories growing up were effectively compressed versions of existing works of fiction. I mean, my dad told me Heart of Darkness as a bedtime story. He told me A Good Man is Hard to Find. He taught me A Small Good Thing. The Raymond Carver story, in which, among other things, a boy gets hit by a car and dies, and the baker who's baking his birthday cake makes a series of threatening phone calls to the dead kid's mourning parents. It's a great story, by the way. But what happened occasionally is that my dad would misremember, or maybe something would get mistranslated or reframed, and sometimes this was corrected by sometimes when I later encountered the real version of the story, the original version of the story, it was better than what I had heard or remembered. I think O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find is probably a little subtler than the version I heard from my dad. As big and bold as that story is, it doesn't get quite as extreme in its moral claims as my dad's did. But then in other cases, the original version is not necessarily as good. I actually think there was something nicely human and, in a way, sort of revealing about my dad's claim that when Dante got to heaven, got to the highest of the high, and he tried to look into the face of God, which he never really does in the poem. But my dad's memory was that he sees Beatrice, this human love that was the thing that led him out of darkness, led him toward the light, and and maybe was also, that if it seems as if that is both elevating the possibilities of human love, the same way that like Plato does when in the Symposium, when he says like, he has Socrates say that, the real purpose of human love is to lead us toward the truth. It seems like maybe that idea that Dante looks into the face of God and sees Beatrice, that idea suggests both that like human love could be more than it seems, and also suggests that maybe God could be less than he seems. And I found that to be a really poignant detail. Of course, it's not at all in the original, which I only found out years later. He remembered the ending of Heart of Darkness quite well, which only made it ring eerily true when I read it in high school. There's another version though of, and I can't remember if this was my dad or if this was my freshman English teacher, Clark, but I went to a weird school. We called our teachers by their first names. Super weird, I know. I even in a poem I later wrote about Clark, I called him Mr. C because his last name also began with a C, because I thought it would be too weird in a poem to try to re-explain that we went to a weird school where we called teachers by their first name. At any rate, I can't remember if it was my dad or it was Clark who said that when Odysseus heard the song of the sirens, it wasn't the song that Homer records in the Odyssey. What he actually heard was the voice of his son Telemachus. And it wasn't the beauty of these haunting sea maidens that made him struggle so fiercely to get free of the restraints he had ordered his men to put on him. It was the startling recognition of his son's voice. Now, there's some problems, right, with this version, like chief among them being that I think Telemachus was an infant when he left, but the sirens are magic, and who knows? He knew Telemachus was a 20-year-old man or however many year old man by the time he passed the sirens, and they could surely make him believe he was hearing his son's voice. Anyway, I just thought that was so. It just seemed so true that when I know I read it as a freshman, which is why I think probably it wasn't Clark, or maybe this was like a secondary version he taught us, but it when I reread it years after that, I was genuinely disappointed when I got to the siren song, because I had integrated the two versions, and I had come to believe that it was in fact in Homer's Odyssey that Odysseus hears the voice of his son. I still think that's the better version. Anyway, it just it made me think about this sort of the problem and the problems and the virtues of misremembering. And I performed a very dumb and less interesting version of this recently on an episode of the podcast when Derek Mong brought up the conventional lyric form of the blazon, and I think it was like he brought up the blazon. I hadn't fully called to mind what it was, and then he called it misogynistic. And I think it was like the combination of those two things that weirdly cemented the initial inclination I had. I think partly it's because emblazon is a word in which the stress falls on blaze, and that's, blazon is related to that, but it's different. And then ballad is a word in which the stress falls on the first syllable, and ballade is a French version in which it falls on the second syllable. I mean, ballad is of course derived from ballade, but anyway, I think it was like it was the shift of pronunciation, the beginning with the letter B, and then that weird compression or not compression, but like the combination of the sound of the form with the concept of misogyny that made me think of, specifically, it wasn't just I thought of the ballade, I thought of Francois Villon's poem, which I had to then look up. Villon, it's probably Villon if you actually speak it well. But he has a poem called, and this will also sound terrible, Ballade des Dames du Temps Jadis, the Ballad of Ladies of Times Gone By. And it is a poem in which he enumerates a bunch of ladies and wonders where they are. And it was famously translated by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who gave it the English refrain, "Where are the snows of yesteryear?" Great refrain. It's not a perfect version, and I don't know how faithful the translation is. I think he makes a couple substitutions, notably in places, but that was the poem that came to mind when he mentioned the blazon and misogyny. And I guess I was thinking of, Villon does emphasize a lot of the beauty of the ladies of time gone by, but he also brings up some weird, they're not all just great beauties of yore. They are sort of odd, interesting historical figures. In many cases, they did things other than just marry an important man. I think the last one he brings up is Joan of Arc. Anyway, that was the poem that came to mind. It's not my favorite poem, but in addition to being a ballade and not a blazon, in addition to being a poem by a man about women, and you can argue about whether it is a virtuous one or a villainous one, it is also an ubi sunt poem. And this didn't put me in mind of another ubi sunt poem. It just brought back to mind a poem on the list of poems. Several episodes ago, I came up with a list of poems I wanted to talk about on the podcast. And one of my very, very favorite poems is, maybe sort of oddly, because I am usually the advocate of clarity and emotional poignancy on a first read. This is a poem that is almost necessarily difficult to read, mostly because nobody really speaks the language in which it's written anymore. People may know it, but nobody speaks it natively, unless you believe my mentor Jane, who claimed that she was once in a little tiny store up in the mountains deep in Appalachia, and a kid who worked at the store turned to her and said, "How have you been holpen?" And she about lost her shit, because she was a Middle English scholar, and she knew that holpen was it was not just a weird wrong construction. It was actually a legitimate old conjugation of the verb to help. So other than the people in that store, nobody really speaks the language of this poem, which is Middle English. So before I read this poem, I will give a gloss. I'm going to basically summarize it for you. And I'm going to say a couple other things too. But the poem, it's we don't know who wrote it. It's not, an anonymous poet. It's from 800 or 900 years ago. We don't know exactly. I think it first appeared in a manuscript from 700 years ago, and we don't know exactly when it was written before that. Though certainly at least much of it was written well after Christ. Though I would say a lot of the sentiment maybe preceded that, or preceded at least the conversion of the poet. So the title of the poem is Ubi sunt qui ante nos fuerunt, and that is Latin for "Where are they who were before?" Ubi sunt qui ante nos fuerunt. Where are they who were before us? This is a Latin motto beloved of medieval scholars and poets. It's also a very old theme in poetry. It wasn't invented in the Middle Ages, but and in fact, one of the better known Old English ubi sunt poems is "The Wanderer," which I've at least talked about on the podcast. I think I quoted some portions of it. It's probably too long to read on here. That is a poem which seems to by my lights, that is a poem that very clearly was written by a pagan and then recorded and bracketed by a Christian with a Christian message to contextualize its otherwise pagan content. And to clarify, if I didn't do so at the time, I don't blame the Christian bracketer at all. I for one thing, if you were a Christian medieval monk, you were like saving the record of Western literature by transcribing it, and sometimes retranscribing it, by hand, painstakingly, for your entire life, just so that those documents could survive the centuries. And added to that, you probably genuinely believed in Christianity, and so you thought that it was really important that everybody come to Jesus. But also, even just on a mercenary level, if you were a medieval Christian scholar and you wanted to preserve a pagan poem, then the best way to do that was to pretend it was a Christian poem. So I can't remember if I mentioned this, but I know that the guy who was asked to cover the genitals of the figures in Michelangelo's Last Judgment, he was such a great admirer of Michelangelo's that he deliberately used a paint that could later be removed. It was never removed, probably because that the chapel is still owned by the church. But that, I think, to me, that's the gesture. That's the gesture of the guy who brackets the poem. Because clearly he is, he's hand recording all this. He's bothering to do so. He, I assume, has some appreciation for the genuine poetry of what he's writing. This is a slightly different case, or maybe I don't know. It's not that different a case, but to me, it's there are a couple degrees of Christian bracketing in this poem. I first encountered it in an old hand-me-down copy of an anthology called 7 Centuries of Verse, edited by A.J. M. Smith, probably no relation. It was published in 1947, and it's an odd selection, but it has some great stuff in there. Some odd exclusions, even within the limited time frame it was considering. But the version of this poem that I read in that book is 4 stanzas long. And here is basically what it says. So it starts by asking the question of the title: where are they who were here before us? And then it describes what they were like. Which people who were here before us? Let me tell you about them. And it specifies they had dogs they led around, right, or went on hunts with, and hawks they carried or they sent to do their bidding. They had fields and woods. And, had there, I think, is doing a couple of possible things. It may be saying they were rich, they had possessions, but also they had them as in they had access to them. They were there with them. They got to have them as a part of creation while they were alive. And describes the ladies with gold in their hair and their bright, beautiful faces. They ate food and they drank and they told jokes. They had fun. They enjoyed being human. They took pleasure in life. Men knelt before them. So these are certainly nobles or rich people that they're talking about, in this case at least. They walked around with pride. They were maybe even a little bit too proud at times. And then in a line that is fully translatable into contemporary English, and in a twinkling of an eye, their souls were lost. The poem then, in the 3rd stanza, asks some other questions, some follow-up questions to the title. Where is their laughing? Where's the laughing of those people who were here, who had these lives, these rich lives before us? Where is that laughing and that song? Processing around with their beautiful garments dragging behind them, trailing behind them, and all the proud way that they walked and carried themselves. Where are their hawks and their hounds? That asking where are the hawks and the hounds really kills me. Another perfectly translatable line: all that joy is went away. That's the answer to the question, where be they that before us were, and where ubi sunt qui ante nos fuerunt? They're gone. And their happiness is gone with them. That happiness, that well-being, that weal, in the old sense, W-E-A-L. Yeah, W-E-A-L. Yeah, I did spell it correctly. Is probably the most literal translation of the word the poet uses. That weal, that wellness, that well-being is come to sorrow, to many hard hours, which is, of course, the title Anthony Heck's second collection, I think, the Hard Hours that won a bunch of big prizes and is a truly great poetry collection. It's directly taken from this poem, though the word that the poet here uses is Stundes, which is presumably related to the contemporary German word Stunde, which means hour. Though I think they use it a little bit more loosely the way they use the word word. When they're talking, they use word to mean like a statement, and I gather that hour can be a little bit looser than merely the 60 minutes that we mean. Certainly, it is in this case. Many hard hours, many hard stundes. They made their paradise here. This was paradise for them, the world, and now they lie in hell together. Hell, the word comes from an old Norse goddess and the realm that she ruled over, which was bad, but was also bad kind of in the gloomy underworld sense of the Greeks and Romans. Hell isn't necessarily hellfire. Now, the next line makes it a little more specific. The fyret brennes evre, the fire it burns forever. I've never thought about that, but this is a Christian poem to some extent at least. And then this weird little envoy. It's not an envoy metrically speaking. It's the poem is every stanza is the same metrically speaking, but I guess rhetorically there's this little lyric. It's sort of this like the moment in the poem, the moment in the pop song when you stop singing the refrain and you start singing la 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 la. Long as I and long as O, long as Y and long as woe. Right, which I love because it's both onomatopoeic and literal speech. Right, long as I and O, right, both. Which is, I and O could be cries of sorrow or pain. I or A is also an old word for forever. Long as Y and long as woe. Right? Long as the question why and long as sorrow. Woe. And then a line that just kills me and doesn't really work in contemporary English. Thence ne cometh they nevere. Thence come they never. They come from that place, never. They are gone. The last line of the poem is, the last word of the poem is never. So it is a poem that to my ear, when I read it the first time, I heard a very pagan sentiment initially, which is life is very short and you can have all the richness in the world, you can have all the pleasure in the world, and the next day a rock could fall on your head. But also, this richness is what we have. This is our paradise. This is where it is given to us to take pleasure in the world. This is what we have. It doesn't last forever. Probably it ends too soon. But this is what we have. We have it now. Others had it then. There's a reminder to us to be humble. We may think we're nobles. We may have people kneeling before us. We may have gold in our hair, but we will eventually be just like those others, right? The ones who thought they were the main characters in their time. They're gone. It's a poignant suggestion. There is also, I think even in the kind of the Christian attitude or this Christian shading of the last stanza, to me, it still feels a little bit more like the underworld, and even in the goneness, the hell, the lostness, the fire. I hear like the I and the O and the Y and the woe. To me, that's not necessarily the dead people down in hell crying out in pain. That's also the people who mourned them, right? And it's our own sorrow at our own mortality. It's all human beings who all face this same inevitability. And the fire, I think my instinct was to read it a little bit the way in the Hebrew scripture they talk about Sheol, hell as a dump, as a place you go throw away your waste and maybe burn it. So there is a fire, but it's a sort of it's just a fire of destruction, which is a lot of Jesus's references to hell even take this sort of form. And they talk about he talks about the second death, right? The annihilation of having your soul die, your mind, your spirit, whatever the experience of being you, what it is like to be you, that is destroyed at death. And it is like the waste, the ashes, ashes to ashes and dust. It's like the waste on the dump that's burned up to make room for more waste. I don't necessarily read it as having to be, victims of their own sin, flailing in a fiery lake while demons poke them with sharp sticks. But then, well, all right, that's the poem. That is what the poem says. This is the version I read first. There's it comes from this Vernon manuscript. That's where we got it from. And there have been a couple different, I'm sure the way it's recorded is a little, the lettering, I'm sure, is a little thorny for a contemporary reader. Well, scholars have rendered it in a couple different versions. The Norton Anthology, at least the one I have, which is the 5th edition, they tend to be pretty scrupulous. I think it's John Galworthy did Stallworthy. Is there another Galworthy? Maybe there's a Galworthy who does something else. Anyway, John Stallworthy, who's a serious guy, I think was in charge of this section, and I trust that he got the scholarship part right. The version I read first is a little different. I think it sounds a little better to my ear, and I think that might have been a choice made by A.J.M. Smith. But here is the poem I just summarized for you. I'm going to read it in Middle English with, I won't call it a bad Middle English accent because there's nobody to check me on that, but I promise you it probably is a bad Middle English accent. All right. Ubi sunt qui ante nos fuerunt. Hi, post-production Matthew here. I'm breaking in to say that upon editing this episode, I noticed that, I ended up reading the Ubi Sunt poem twice, and in both cases, I found, to my endless horror, I had used a truly egregious poetry voice. I was a little taken aback because I'm usually pretty good about avoiding that, but I think maybe the Middle English fooled me, like not having an immediate intuitive grasp of the denotation, having sort of like a slightly, 1 or 2 degrees removed sense of it, just gave my unconscious the freedom it needed to steer my speaking voice into the realms of the wistful and tonally incoherent. So I'm going to spare you those readings and re-record the poem here. I think because I read it twice, once at the beginning of the little discussion and then once at the end, I'm going to re-record it twice so that you don't have the slightly uncanny experience of hearing the same recording repeated later and sort of picking up on little funny quirks of one particular delivery and then feeling the kind of the grating sense of repetition, like the mechanical repetition that comes with hearing the same recording twice and having the speaker pretend that you're hearing a new recording. Anyway, I'm clearly overthinking this a little bit, but I thank you for indulging my intrusion. And now, let's see if I can read this fucking poem without sounding like a total asshole. Ubi sunt qui ante nos fuerunt. The Middle English accent is still going to be bad, so that part I can't really help, but here we go. Where beth they that beforen us weren? Hundes laden and havekes beren, and hadden failed and woda. The rich levadis in Hedebur. By the way, it's where be they that before us were, hounds they led, and hawks they bore, and they had fields and woods. And then the rich levedes is the rich ladies. So in some versions, the V is a U, so it's luedes maybe. But anyway, I'll start again. Just trying to let you get your bearings a little bit in this weird fucking old poem. Where beth they that beforen us weren? Hundesladen and havik his beren, and Hardenfeld and Woda. The rich levedes in her boer, that werden golden her tresur, with her briek de roda. Eten and drunken and maren him glad, her lief was all with gamen I lad. Men knelleden hem beforen. They beren hem well sweet a he, and in a twinkling of an eye, her sulies weren verloren. Where is that lowing and that song, that trailing and that prude gong, the havikies and the hundies? All that joy is went away. That wail is common to wail away, to mania harde stundis. Here paradis they nomen her, and nu they lien in helle fair, the fuir it brennes evere. Long is I, and long is O, long is why, and long is woe. Venice ne cometh the nevere. It just kills me. Venice ne cometh the nevere. So I love this poem. I find it to be beautiful and shapely and tonally difficult to pin down, right? Because there is certainly some wagging of the finger at the rich people. These are mostly rich people, and they were proud. They thought much of themselves. But that also, I read that not just as Christian chastisement of the high and mighty, but as a reminder to us. We are proud. We are. And they are no different. They are no different. We are no different from them. And as I said, I mean, I think the end is certainly bears the marks of Christian thinking, but to my ear doesn't seem to be quite as conclusive in its moralizing as a purely Christian reading might insist. That said, the version in the Norton and the version that is apparently the complete version, though my anthology is not the only anthology to include only the first 4 stanzas. There is enough dispute that in certain scholarly work on the manuscript, I am not the only one to find the last 6 stanzas of this poem to be markedly inferior. I won't summarize, well, I won't translate them and I won't go through them stanza by stanza, line by line, but any suggestion of a Christian interpretation is hammered out very explicitly. I'll read you just the next stanza, the 5th stanza. There are 5 more after that. I mean, it's way too long. If there is a Christian message to take from this, it is taken within those 4 first stanzas. But in case you missed it, right? If it was too short to read, here's the long version. And he just repeats himself, essentially saying, don't be like them, turn to God. God is your rod and staff. God is the way. Be good, be Christian, don't go to hell. I mean, we're told this over and over and over again. It's really dreary. I find the writing is much worse than in the first 4 stanzas. It's much less shapely. It doesn't sound as pretty to the ears. And I just find it rhetorically kind of repugnant. I know there's some Christian listeners, and I don't want to speak crudely about Christian thinking, but while there are many aspects of Christianity, I grew up deep within it, and there are many aspects of Christianity I still find profoundly admirable. The part I may find least admirable is or maybe not least. Least has got to be the long and horrifying legacy of child abuse of the worst kind in the Catholic Church. I mean, I guess there were also the crusade. I mean, there were a lot of bad things, but in terms of the Christian outlook on the world, the version of it that I find most curdled and least convincing is the version that the last 6 stanzas of this poem cannot get enough of. So here's the 5th stanza. Dregi Herman den if du wilt, a little pina that me thee bit, with through thine eases ofta, they thee pina be unrede, and thou thinken on thee mede, hit sal the thinken softa. So, what this means is, line by line, then suffer, man, if you will. Right? Because these other guys went to hell for being proud and haughty and thinking too highly. I mean, we don't even hear about a lot of sins other than pride and pleasure in life, right? They're not murderers. They're not thieves. I mean, unless you think poverty is theft. But, these are not ghoulish figures. These are just people enjoying the world, right? So this poem says, don't be like them. Don't, your life with Gamani Lad, right? Instead, suffer, right? Because of everything you've heard before, suffer here, man, then, if you will, a little pain that me thee bit, a little pain that I bid you to suffer, right? Because you don't want to go to hell and suffer for eternity, suffer here as I bid you do. So this is now, I guess, God talking, or presumably God, or maybe the priest. A little pain that I bid you suffer. Withdraw thine eyes often. It's funny, this is the one line that gets no gloss or footnote in the Norton, but is to me it's a weird line. Withdraw your eyes often. So turn away. It's also a standalone sentence, seemingly. So it's not referring to the sentence before, the sentence after. It's a statement in itself. Look meekly, keep your eyes down, look away, withdraw your eyes away from the world, away from other things. And then, just again, to drive the message home, though your pain be severe, though your pain be unbearable, if you think on the reward that is heaven, then it will make it'll make the pain seem soft to you. It'll make it softer. So suffer here, choose to suffer rather than feel pleasure, because feeling pleasure leads you to hell. Choose to suffer, and because I tell you to suffer, not because some pain in life is necessary, but because I'm choosing to say, yes, you should suffer. Turn away from the pleasures of the world, suffer here, and if you ever find it unbearable, then just think about how it'll be great in heaven, and then you'll be okay, and probably you'll stop complaining. And while you're at it, keep your eyes down. I can't help but find this odious as an argument. I mean, to me, it like smacks of everything that's bad about the Indian caste system, right? Don't worry, you'll be rewarded in the next life. For now, get in line, do what I say. God wants you to suffer and does not want you to enjoy life. I mean, again, I don't think all Christians think that. I don't even think most Christians think that. But it is a canonical part of Christian thought. And it was an aspect of Christian thinking that was very heavily emphasized at my Catholic school. So I have a special resentment toward it. Anyway, that is basically the rest of the poem. It keeps going that way forever. But in an odd way, I find the work of A.J.M. Smith and whoever else, whatever other scholar of the Vernon manuscript left off the last six stanzas, I find that to be another sort of if this is either this is a Christian addendum to a poem. I mean, it really doesn't seem to. The writing is just much worse. It doesn't seem to be the same poet, but it feels like either somebody has added this on. And maybe he goes beyond, right? He goes a good ways beyond what the bracketer of the Wanderer does. It seems like the person writing these last 6 stanzas really means them. But it's interesting. Like somebody has made some editorial choices, right? Maybe there's a purer pagan version of the first 3 or 4 stanzas, and whoever recorded those rounded them off in the way that Catullus rounds off Sappho's fragment. And because I think I don't quarrel with the Christian suggestions in the first 4 stanzas, partly because I don't find them overwhelming. The first 4 stanzas are all descriptive. Here is what happened. The last 6 stanzas are all prescriptive. Here is what you ought to do. I find that there's some good editing going on, there's some bad editing going on, and finally, the anthologists and the scholars who have chopped off the tail of this poem, the fat, long tail of the poem, I think are doing the poem a service. And they leave us with these, I think, really beautiful 4 stanzas. I'll read them one more time, just because I like them, and I think they sound great. Where are they who went before us? Ubi sunt qui ante nos fuerunt. I almost read them. The Norton's version is probably truer, but the meter is a little fucked up in the way they have it rendered. So here's the A.J.M. Smith rendering, or his the way he recorded it anyhow. Ubi sunt qui ante nos fuerunt. Where are they who before us were? Where beth they that before us weren? Hundesladen and Havekes beren, and Hardenfeld and Woda. The rich levadies in her boere that werden golden herter sure, with hera briek de roda. Eten and drunken and maren hem glad, her lief was all with gamany lad, men knelleden hem beforen. They beren hem well sweet a he, and in a twinkling of an eye, her sulies weren forloren. Where is that loching and that song, that trailing and that prude gong, though Havekes and though Hundies? All that joy is went away. That wail is common to wail away, to many a harde stundies. Her paradis they nomen her, and nu they lien in helle fair. The fuir it brennes evere. Long is I, and long is O, long is why, and long is woe. Then ne cometh the nevere. One more quick note, because it gave me a little trouble at first. The first few times I read it. Nu they lien in helle fere. That fere is not fire. There's an Ezra Pound poem about Jesus, weird poem, interesting poem, called The Ballad of the Goodly Fair. I think that's what it is. Ballad of the Goodly Fair, is that right? Yeah, The Ballad of the Goodly Fair, which is like a companion. So now they lie in hell. Fair is now they lie in hell together. They're gone, but they are gone together. And we may soon be with them. Though I hope not in the hell version. I hope not in the horrible fire lake of fire. That would be very bad. I'm on record. This whole podcast is on record as taking a stand against hell. Hell is bad. We do not like hell here at SLEERICKETS. Since I originally mistook the Blazon form for the ballad, specifically in the case of an Ubi Sunt ballad, the ballad of the ladies of time gone by, I thought I would finish with an Ubi Sunt poem that is also a blazon, and to boot maybe misogynistic, though I think not necessarily. I think you be the judge. I can imagine Alice. I can imagine her both liking this poem and rolling her eyes at it, but we'll see. So this is a poem by Donald Justice, who's not. It's funny. He really is one of my very favorites, and I always forget about him. I think he's just such a quiet presence. But I've read and reread his collected, and it's extraordinary. I mean, his like Larkin's, like House, I mean, those are collected to envy. Not just because there's so many good poems in them, but because there's so few bad ones. I don't think he didn't write bad. He was selective about what he published. And the collected it's fat for a book of poetry, but it's small for a collected. small for an anthology. It's small for a life's work, and yet it is pretty precious. So Sonnet About P. Oh, I meant to say, sorry. The other thing my teacher Clark did definitely do is he mistakenly explained the concept of an ubi sunt poem. He was a Latin teacher. Interestingly, he spoke Latin. He did little Latin courses on we did a little short term because we were a weird school. Did little like 1 month classes, and he would teach Latin then. So he loved Latin, and he played on a softball team, and the uniforms had they wore like gas station shirts, and above the breast pocket, where you would normally have a name, embroidered in cursive, they had the words ubi sunt. And he explained this, and apparently he's not the only person to use the term this, apparently he's not the only person to make this mistake, but he explained the ubi sunt as an expression of nostalgia. That is to say, ubi sunt, where are they? Where are the good old days? Where is our youth? Where are the people we knew when we were younger? There's actually the Terence Winch poem Sex Elegy, which is not great, but very memorable. Very memorable, and has some good stuff in it. I think he begins by asking, like, where are they, all those people I used to have sex with? So, of course, that's not what it means. He was wrong that it's about nostalgia, but it's a kind of a good revision. Like, I kind of like that, right? It's sort of a nice idea. And so Sonnet About P is actually more of an ubi sunt poem in Clark's sense. It is a poem about the days of youth that are gone. Like a lot of poems written by men about the days of youth, it focuses on the ladies, the women we used to know, the women I used to know, the speaker used to know. And, there are poems about very beautiful women known in youth that are cruel. Zara wrote in about Horace's 125, which is about a very popular woman getting old. So there are plenty of poems that sort of that mock or sort of speak harshly to young and beautiful women, or either in the present or in the past tense, and chastise them. Herrick does a version of this, though in kind of a fun way. John Crowe Ransom does a little bit of this. Yeats, in his weird way, in his sort of love-hate poetic relationship with Maud Gonne, writes No Second Troy. He doesn't mock her for getting older, but he's pretty hard on her for the way she treated others in her youth, when she was in the full bloom of beauty. And Larkin has a sort of a sour but snappy and I think still charming poem called Wild Oats, about being young and dating a woman and getting dumped. So this is another poem about a very beautiful woman who is sort of unapproachable. And part of what I like about it is that it doesn't take the route that I expected it to take. It doesn't simply become a bitter poem about how she sucks or now she's old. It's something different, while still doing all the things that these other poems do, like talk about specific body parts of the woman. In Shakespeare's 130 that Derek mentioned, that mocks the form of the blazon, he says, let me see if I have it by heart. I don't know if I do. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun, D-U-N, like dirt colored. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. The operative word in that sentence, by the way, is not wires as it sounds to our ears, because we think of like modern day wires, which are you would not want your hair to look like that. But wires in his time, wire, the original word comes from I think it's Old English word wiorkan, which refers to worked metal. So wire, if you were comparing your beloved's hair to wire, you were comparing it to finely worked gold. And so he says, yeah, if her hair is wire, it's black. It's black wire. It's not the good kind. It's something weird going on with the gold. So anyway, he says, my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks, and in her perfume, and in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to see her go. Does it say I love to see her go? Like I hate to see you go, but I love to watch you leave. Like the corny line about women's bottoms. What is it? What fuck? I knew I would forget part of it. Oh, I love to hear her speak. Yeah, I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I swear I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as fair as any she. Belied, god damn it. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Anyway, great poem. I mean, really, like one of the best of his sonnets, one of the best sonnets, certainly. But not the poem I actually meant to talk about. Sonnet About P is a sincere blazon, though maybe a double-edged one in a couple places. And as if to punctuate that, he recalls Shakespeare's comparison. You know, Shakespeare says, all of those phony poets compare their lovers' breasts with snow. I'll say that mine is done. She's, you know, which is, there's also suggestions about racial questions as well as questions of class. You know, if you were fair, that meant you were white, but also in a basically all-white culture, that was largely what that meant is that you didn't have to work outdoors, so you stayed pale. Whereas if you were poor and you had to work outdoors, you got real tan. And also, if you were, you know, dark skin, dark was considered ugly and bad, and lots of obvious racist sort of things. Anyway, this is not a poem about racism, nor is it an ironic blazon. It's a sincere blazon. But I think it's actually quite good. It's called Sonnet About P. It's by Donald Justice. A woman I knew had seemed most beautiful for being cold and difficult of access. I'll start that again, just to make sure you got your bearings. Sonnet About P by Donald Justice. A woman I knew had seemed most beautiful for being cold and difficult of access. I saw my friend, the cleverest man of us, but for a word from her to make him whole, himself fall speechless, like a boy at school. And others also, followers of the chase, look up or down, but not into that face, owing to the perfection of the skull. I knew this lady a dozen years ago, since that she has to 2 or 3 been kind, after long siege, and these not of her sort, and that she has both given and taken hurt. Hearing all this and more, I call to mind that high, improbable bosom, which was snow. So it's an Italian sonnet with kind of an odd rhyme scheme for the sestet. Don't worry, Elijah. I'm not getting in your territory. I won't do a metrical breakdown of the poem, but it's a mostly slant-rhymed sonnet spoken in, I just think, a wonderfully controlled tone. In you know, the beginning, you know, the octave is a description of this woman who was so beautiful and so icy that she unmanned all of his friends, even the smartest among them. Owing to the perfection of the skull, I think is quite good because it both suggests a kind of an almost like queasy concern with bone structure, as well, of course, as being a kind of a memento mori, right? She was so beautiful. Her bone structure, her skull was so perfect, but also she possessed a skull. She possessed bones, and eventually that is all she would be. But then the sestet, since, which is, you know, both sort of suggests causality, but then also, in this case, it's more about time passing. Since that she has to 2 or 3 been kind. she was warm. There was some, it's not clear exactly what this meant. It's not clear if this means she dated them. Who knows? But she showed generosity to a few people. She's not a saint. After a long siege, I mean, that suggests probably that maybe they were courting her, and she wasn't just, it's not just that she dated them and broke their hearts. It's that she showed them kindness. And these not of her sort, right? So the ones she showed kindness to in particular were not of her sort. I assume by not of her sort, he means not as beautiful. Not out of her league, so to speak. Or sorry, not, she was out of their league, but she was kind to them. And I love this line, and that she has both given and taken hurt. Again, we're not talking about somebody who became a, pediatric oncology nurse. We're talking about someone who has lived, an ordinary life and showed some generosity of spirit, and also behaved badly at times and had others behave badly toward her. She's suffered in normal ways. Hearing all this and more, I call to mind that high improbable bosom which was snow. Right? There's a funniness about that, because it's obviously the snow is very cold, just as she was considered cold, but also beautiful. I mean, almost stereotypically beautiful. And the breast is both guarded and vulnerable. It's kind of the seat of her emotion, as well as being, at least the upper part of her chest, presumably, one of the parts of her that was visible to the world. And the past tense of the second to last word is all he says about time having taken its toll on her, right? As it does on everybody. But, for a poem about someone who was so perfect and so beloved and so sort of painfully admired by those who she struck dumb with her beauty and her demeanor, he doesn't say she's not the woman she used to be, she's gone gray, her face is lined. He doesn't do any of the things that Horace does in making fun of this fading beauty. He just refers to this one part of her, body part, a blazon. The only names is the skull and the bosom, but it's still basically a blazon, I would say. He just thinks of this one part of her that signifies the rest of her beauty, and all he says is that it was snow. And of course, like everything else, it's changed over time. So I love this poem because it's about a different kind of emotion than I initially thought it would be, right? I thought it would be a little bit of a revenge poem, maybe, like No Second Troy or Wild Oats, or maybe a wistful poem like Sex Elegy. But it is a little wistful, but it's really about coming to see someone as a real person after you had only known her as an unapproachable object of desire. And he's hearing all this. Somebody brought her up. He isn't even necessarily seeing her at all, but he heard of her, and she seems different to him now. She's more human, but also she's more human in the best and in the worst ways. And yet he doesn't pretend that that this now means that he thinks of her. I think of her as P the lawyer. No, he still thinks that initial mark is indelible, but he calls it to mind in a kind of an odd tribute to her. So again, I think there are probably some very obvious and persuasive arguments that this is a shitty misogynistic poem. I still quite like it. I think it's pretty beautiful. All right, I'll read it one more time and then I'll say goodnight. Sonnet About P by Donald Justice. A woman I knew had seemed most beautiful for being cold and difficult of access. I saw my friend, the cleverest man of us, but for a word from her to make him whole, himself fall speechless, like a boy at school. and others also, followers of the chase. Look up or down, but not into that face, owing to the perfection of the skull. I knew this lady a dozen years ago. Since that she has to 2 or 3 been kind, after long siege, and these not of her sort, and that she has both given and taken hurt. Hearing all this and more, I call to mind that high, improbable bosom, which was snow. All right, this has been your annual birthday episode. I will have a regular episode for you Wednesday, which is probably tomorrow. Oh, which means I've been real off lately. I may be late again this week. I'm going to try to be on time, but we'll see. We'll see how my editing skills go. But that is all for now. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.